You know, one of the earliest times that I told somebody I was undocumented, and it was, and pardon my language, it was scary as shit coming out as undocumented, because I remember I'd made up my mind I wanted to tell my buddy Jeff that I was undocumented. He had grown up right down the street from me, and him and I had done creek cleanups with the boys, what were they called, Boy Scouts, and so I decided, I made up my mind, it was a couple years ago, I was like, I'm going to tell Jeff I'm undocumented, and I hope it goes well. You know, we've been friends for a long time, so hopefully he'll understand. And I remember right before I was going to tell him, we're hanging out, he's telling me all about Herman Cain's 999 tax plan. Now he thought it was like the best thing ever. And I was like, oh my God, like, dude, this is not like the best thing to be telling me right now. He's telling me about the Republican primaries, and I was like, oh, this is not going to go well. But I just spilled my heart out and told him that about my life, and just some of the other, he knew me, but he didn't know me. He didn't know this whole other part of my life that had been going on, being undocumented, and what that meant to me. So that's, for my own situation, for that of my family, my community, that's really the impetus for why I organize, because I'm in a political circumstance, and so the only way I can get out of it is by organizing and developing politically conscious institutions and leaders that can affect a change for a political solution. So that's also part of the work that I do with the North Bay Organizing Project. Just briefly, MBOP is a multi-issue, multi-member organization that ranges from labor, immigrant rights, progressive, faith-based congregations. And let me tell you something, there's nothing quite like having a public official put a little bit of fear of God in them as far as community organizing. That's one effective way to organize, and there's many ways, as we'll get to here with Chris, but yeah, and we can get into some of those things a little bit later, but that's my story, so thank you.
We're also happy to share that Jesus is going to be the new lead organizer at the Graton Day Labor Center. All right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, my name is Maureen Purtill. I grew up in Sebastopol, just a few miles west of here. Very privileged white girl in a very segregated community, thinking that everything was fine for a really long time, until it started to occur to me that not everybody was living the life that I was living, and not having access to the sports that I was playing, and the music that I was learning, and the art that I was creating, and that really started to make me feel deeply sad. And just deeply in grief for this separation that I was living and benefiting from every day. And so throughout the development of myself as a young person growing up in this community and then eventually leaving, I developed this commitment to really trying to bridge some of those gaps that I saw there and here and the broader Sonoma County community. And in many different ways tried to do that, working with migrant youth, organizing with the Day Labor Center, trying to educate myself as a white person, figuring out what's my role as a white person in the movement. I don't want to take the position that a person of color could have that would be a really cool job for them, and always along the way trying to make these strategic choices about how to develop myself intellectually and as an organizer, but also not, reproduce the systems of depression and domination that I was experiencing and seeing and then benefiting from at the same time. So my whole life has been kind of like this process of making those choices at each moment, and I hope that we'll get a chance to talk about that in the context of all this too. But right now, where I have landed is I'm the organizer for ALMAS, which is the Alianza de Mujeres Activas y Solidarias, which is the Women's Action and Solidarity Alliance of the Graton Day Labor Center. Raise your hand if you are familiar with the Graton Day Labor Center. And I won't. Okay, good, nice. So ALMAS is the domestic worker group, a women's organizing effort of the center, and there are two major goals of the group. The first is the internal development of women workers at the Labor Center, and so we work to promote the fact that there are domestic workers at the Labor Center who can do house cleaning and child and elder care. And then the second primary goal of the group is to change the world and make it a better place for domestic workers and immigrant women and all women and all people. And the way that ALMAS has chosen to do that primarily is to engage in campaigns for domestic workers' rights, In the 30s in this country, when most of the major labor laws were passed that we all benefit from now, domestic workers and farm workers were explicitly excluded from those laws, so they didn't have access to overtime pay, meal and rest breaks, any of the normal, if you work at Starbucks, you have access to these laws now. And 75 years later, this June 25th will mark the 75th anniversary of the Fair Labor Standards Act. 75 years later, they still don't have access to those laws. So domestic workers are struggling at the state level and at the national level. You gonna fix me?
Yeah.
Please. Oh, nice. Okay. Better? Better? Okay. Whoa, that's way too much. So 75 years later, domestic workers are still excluded from these laws. And so ALMAS is at the forefront of this state and national and global movement to include domestic workers in basic labor protections. And I have the honor of working with them every day and supporting those efforts and providing some infrastructure and some training and some access to collaboration and allyship with other domestic worker organizations in the state. And before I pass the mic, I just want to share one story. I want to tell you about Dora. Dora is an El Salvadoran woman immigrant. She came to the United States about 5 years ago after her family had survived the tragic earthquakes in El Salvador in the early 2000s and had rebuilt their home, but still found that they didn't have enough money to continue ahead and plan for their retirement. So she left her husband and her children and came to Windsor. And in the last 5 years, Dora has worked as a domestic worker. She's mostly done in-home support, live-in caregiving for elderly people. And her last job, before she came to the Labor Center, Dora was a live-in caregiver for a man in Windsor, and he paid her $800 a month to live in and care for him. And the agreement was that she would work 5 hours a day in the morning from 8 to 1, providing food, doing the grocery shopping, kind of getting the house clean. And then she would have the rest of the day free and the weekends free to look for other work. That was the agreement. The reality was that he also forced her to work 5 additional hours in the evening to hang out with him, to watch TV, to make his dinner. He kind of manipulated her into feeling like she had to do that since she was given this place to live. And so she was paid $200 a week to work 10-hour days, which came out to something like $4 an hour. And so after a few months of this, Dora decided she was not going to take it anymore, and even though she had nowhere to go, no job, no house, she left the job and found her way to the Graton Day Labor Center. And in the last 4 or 5 months, Dora has become one of the most active members of our group. She's in Washington, D.C. right now, lobbying for immigration reform, and is just become this amazing source of strength and love for the movement, and is just one of many women who have these extreme stories here locally, but have found a vehicle to really fight for her dignity. And it's an honor to work with her. And so anyway, I'll leave it at that for now.
Hi, I'm Tess, and stories like that really make me mad. Not the second part, the first part, about people being exploited. So, let's see. I grew up I'm Tess McDermott, I guess I should get that out of the way. I'm 21, I'm a student at the JC. I am currently studying environmental science. I would like to get into energy and climate science because I want to do research to help prevent climate change. That's my big thing. But I also work with organizing in the community of Santa Rosa, and I have for about almost 2 years now, I guess. So I guess we already had one coming out story, so I'll give a couple more. I can come out in a lot of ways. I'm an anarchist, I'm trans, and I'm queer, and I also have bipolar disorder. So I guess those are definitely 4 things that have really helped to shape how and what I organize in. I was born in Indiana, and I think there were 2 people of color at my first school, at my elementary school, and let's see, one was objectified by the school and made into like this sensation, and this racist old teacher claimed that he hit her, and there was like this huge scandal, and he was totally like wrongfully targeted and stuff just because of his skin color. And this other kid didn't have any friends until me and a couple other people became his friends after he moved there. And so growing up in that kind of environment and having, my parents are professors, and they were very clear to tell me when oppression was happening. They were like, look, like, it's wrong that Jacoby was targeted by the school for that. It's wrong that he was expelled for something that they can't even prove happened, because this, you know, white teacher claimed that this black kid hit her. They're just going to go with that without even really investigating it. They were like, that's wrong, and here's why. So I was raised with kind of seeing into that side of things, and I'm a very privileged white girl too. I mean, I definitely grew up with privileges that I didn't recognize, but I started to, because, you know, my parents were very clear to tell me, like, you have things that other people don't have access to. And I guess I was never really encouraged to go out and seek why, but I did on my own, because I just didn't like why. Why? And so I guess to me it's really important for people to not judge books by their cover. And I think that's something that is a huge thing that's ignored with intersectionality as a grander ideal. Like, we talk about making movements more inclusive, but we don't really, a lot of people don't really think about how that is translated into our everyday lives, like just treating each other nicer. Like, hey, you know, I'm gonna, no matter what this person looks like, I'm going to be genuinely nice to them, and I am going to do my best to not step on their toes. And so that, to me, is, I don't know, it sounds really simple in my mind, and so that's my biggest thing. And I guess an example I could give of that is a lot of people in the modern feminist movement are very anti-trans, and claim that, like, trans people like myself have no place in women's only spaces and stuff like that. And it's a huge point of contention right now. And to me, you know, you look at that and it's just a simple matter of, like, does someone identify as a woman? Do they, you know, are they treated differently because of that? Then yeah, we have to consider, you know, how they've been marginalized and include them in this movement of bringing equality to everybody. So I don't know, I went off on a tangent, I guess, a little, but to me, I've done a lot of organizing in Santa Rosa, various projects, both, you know, with whatever, and right now I'm working with the California State Student Union, which is working to address inequality and oppression in the educational system, because, as I'm sure most of you know, if you have a student in your life of any color, gender, or creed, you know that students are getting screwed right now, especially women students and students of color. And so it's a huge struggle right now, because education really is the key to all of these issues that we're talking about, getting people aware of why these things happen and why, you know, why the world is like it is, basically. And so if our I see it as if our education system is screwed, then our whole, right, the whole wider population, the whole youth, the future is kind of screwed. And so that's why, I guess, being a student, and I see education as a way to bring intersectionality to the minds of people, because people don't necessarily think about that when they think about social organizing. So that's my spiel. Yeah. I'll stop now.
Well, hello. It's very nice to be here. My name is Chris Crass, and I have a lot of love for the activism and organizing in Santa Rosa and Petaluma and just Sonoma County in general. Just thinking about, I grew up down in Orange County, California, so just kind of like suburbs, smaller cities, smaller towns, just people who are doing political work in those spaces. I just have a lot of love for, and just knowing, you know, Carl was talking earlier about our having worked together through Catalyst Project and the Ann Braden program. I've just met a lot of really incredible people over the past, you know, really couple decades who have, you know, come from Santa Rosa and just really done a lot of really fantastic work in this area in general. So it's really beautiful to be here. My book just came out this week, and so this is kind of the first real event that's about the book. So it's really nice to be here. So as I mentioned, I grew up in Orange County. My grandparents were grassroots organizers for the right, essentially meaning that they were trying to advance an agenda against women, against communities of color, against the vast majority of humanity, really. But I learned a lot, from the ways that my grandparents operated. I mean, they wouldn't have identified as, yes, we are organizers of the right. Well, my grandfather would have. He was a member of the John Birch Society, which, for those of you who know what that is, it was one of the far-right, anti-communist right-wing organizations. But a lot of what they did was they were very involved in their churches. They were very involved in their communities. My grandmother was a very active member of, the Historical Society, a variety of things. But through their involvement in the community, it was really kind of helping to create an overall kind of culture that supported right-wing politics, conservatism. And so I really grew up then with my liberal Democrat parents arguing with my Republican grandparents at the dinner table, and as a 12, 13-year-old, trying to understand these arguments. It was very, very interesting. But then, I became an anarchist, basically believing that, everyday people have the ability to govern their lives and build up the institutions and the economy that can be distributed equitably, and that we can come together in cooperation as opposed to competition. And so, as a 15-year-old kind of coming to radical politics 25 years ago in Orange County, it was kind of like, okay, how do I make sense of my life? And a lot of that was organized through punk rock and youth culture, and just kind of protesting the long list of things that we saw that we opposed, which included at the time the Gulf War in the early 90s. That the first Bush president was leading. Soon after that, the Rodney King, which for those of you who remember Rodney King, internationally witnessed police brutality case, widely viewed, widely seen, widely condemned, widely protest, and then 30 minutes from my hometown where I was, watching the news one afternoon, seeing that the police officers, all of them white, brutally beating African-American Rodney King, all acquitted. Well, it just so happened that morning was the first time I had consciously read a book written by a person of color. It was W.B. Du Bois' The Souls of Black Folks. And I had just recently realized, I had been an activist. I'd been involved in social justice work for a few years, which meant, protesting the Gulf War, being involved in, we put out an underground newspaper at our high school, stuffing, these little newsletters into people's lockers, and just doing whatever we could to kind of put out radical politics and social justice politics. So really kind of having just recently kind of come to consciousness that my worldview, although I didn't understand really what it meant, was incredibly shaped by white supremacy. And that was coming from the influence of, the only black friend, that I'd ever had in my life up until that point, who was really encouraging me to learn and study and engage. And so I had read this book because for several months hanging out with him, I'd go over to his house, and he was, a couple years older than me, go to his house, and he had this incredible poster about African-American history and social justice leaders. And I would ask him, who are these people? Like, I could recognize Martin Luther King, and I recognized Malcolm X, who at the time I was kind of like, well, I don't really understand that. He really hates white people. I don't quite understand it. But I'd be like, who are these people? And he would explain, but I'd always forget who they were, and all this kind of stuff. And I'd be like, tell me again, who's Sojourner Truth? Like, what was she doing again? And so eventually he was like, you're committed to social justice. You need to understand who Ella Baker is. You need to understand who Sojourner Truth is. You need to understand who Langston Hughes is, not because you want to become a better friend to me as a black person and you want to know more about my people, but you need to understand who these people are because they're your leaders and you've been denied them all your life. You've been denied the black freedom struggle all your life. And you need it. Not because you want to be my friend, not because you want to understand black people, but because you need it to be free and you need it to engage in social justice work. And so here I am, I'm reading W.E.B. Du Bois, I just finished it, and the Rodney King verdict comes out, and my mind is just, I don't know what to do with myself, but I know that my entire worldview is crashing, and I feel this tremendous anger and emptiness and sadness and rage. And it was just kind of stories like this, and I've got other stories around, friends of mine, women who talked with me for hours about sexism and patriarchy and ways that this was happening within our activist group. We're a bunch of teenagers trying to figure this stuff out, and a lot of us, I think, and for myself this is certainly true, and I really engage with this in the book, is that for many of us we come into consciousness around what we oppose, around what is either trying to destroy us, attack those we love, destroy the earth, but come into consciousness and action through what we oppose. And eventually we start to realize that what we oppose is also inside of us. That what we oppose is part of our consciousness, part of who we are, based on different ways that we're positioned in society. And then pretty soon, when we start to really try to organize and come together with people, we realize that what we oppose also divides us from one another. And during those kinds of time periods, when you start to realize how much of this stuff is deeply internalized, and how much of this, because, when I was 16, I really thought if we could just get a whole lot of us together, we could just get rid of that handful of capitalists and just remake this world. And then pretty soon, I started realizing that I'm actually divided by a whole lot of these systems with my comrades here on the panel. With comrades here. That pretty soon we're going to be unable to work together. That we're going to have ways that we're reproducing the same dynamics and same power relationships amongst ourselves. And that not only that, but this is inside of me in a way that is deeply harming me. And so out of these various kinds of experiences and realizations, there was a lot of soul searching, and a lot of us started trying to figure out, okay, how can we engage in anti-racist work as white people? How can we engage in feminist work as men? How can those of us who come from a class background, whether it's middle class or upper class, connect with our working class comrades and really come to consciousness around, have class consciousness grounded in a working class socialist again? How can we really have an economy that works for all people as opposed to all of us working for a handful of people? And so how can we really build just systems? And so how can we have these kinds of consciousness and politics that's rooted in popular struggle and in people's communities and lives? Bell Hooks, longtime black feminist, intellectual, put forward this concept of collective liberation. And she talked about the interconnection, and this was being talked about intersectionality, the interconnection of different systems of oppression. The ways that when one of us is working against patriarchy and working for feminist struggle here, white supremacy comes in and divides and tears apart those movements, and unless we have an anti-racist feminist politics, then we're not going to be able to really struggle on the wide range of issues that we need to have. Well, simultaneously, we also need to have a working class-based struggle to really get into that. Well, pretty soon, you're talking about a whole lot of different things where it's like, oh my goodness, in order to be able to do this one thing, I need to do 20 things other in order for this one thing to be effective. And that can be fairly overwhelming for, I'm sure many of you have experienced that, of how do I work on this campaign in a way that simultaneously is undermining and advancing freedom for all people? It can be difficult, right? But Bell Hooks talks about collective liberation. And so for me, as a young kid who's trying to figure out, okay, I have these various forms of white privilege, male privilege, these different kinds of things. So if these systems are interconnected, then our liberation is interconnected. And so for me, it was kind of trying to think about, okay, how can we have a proactive, positive forward-moving vision and agenda that can move people who are positioned in places of privilege in relationship to those who experience systemic oppression? How can we move white people in significant numbers, not just a handful who, come out to, people of color events or racial justice struggles, but how can we really develop leadership in white communities that are going to move significant numbers of people away from an agenda that is deeply ingrained in white supremacy and supports an overall kind of the inequity of a general worldview in society of, everyone just pulls themselves up by their bootstraps, and those who are poor for their own reason, this whole worldview. How can we organize men in significant numbers to understand that feminism is deeply connected to my own humanity, my future? I'm raising, I have an almost 2-year-old son. I want him to grow up with feminist possibilities all around him. I want him to grow up with role models, values, cultural institutions, social institutions that are regularly reinforcing to him that feminism is a liberatory value system for all of us, and that there are ways for him to proactively be a feminist. And we'll see. Maybe his gender is also going to change over time, and he's going to be, genderqueer, or but I want him to have an understanding of gender that is deeply committed to feminism, not just because me and my partner are doing that in our home, but because there are millions of people who are engaged in this struggle for collective liberation, and there are tens of thousands of beautiful, effective, strong, humble, sweet, tender feminist men who are rocking it. And so collective liberation is trying to understand how can we move away from, and I understand it's stages. We start here, we move here, we go there. We need to recognize there's stages of growth, there's stages of development, but we need to support people through those stages of development and not have people stuck in whether or not, for myself, definitely periods of time of guilt, shame, sadness, hurt, feeling like, is there anything I can do in this world that's not going to reinforce the worst of what I'm against? Are there ways that I can actually engage in work for justice in ways that aren't going to simultaneously reinforce these systems of oppression? And pretty soon, some folks, and I'm sure those of you who have really tried thinking about whether it's like as a man, as somebody who's middle class, but you start to try to work your way through these, how I'm positioned in society and reinforce that pretty soon you can think that the only thing I can do for justice is stay home and stay out of the way. Well, we need an agenda and a vision that excites people, moves people, connects to their hearts, and helps everyone understand that there are incredibly powerful, meaningful, soul-fulfilling roles, many roles for many people to play that are positive, proactive, concrete, and have an agenda and a strategy as a movement where we can come together and reflect that and build upon that. And we need to be clear that there's going to be all kinds of problems and all kinds of mistakes. We're not talking about trying to create some sort of utopian plan. There's going to be problems, there's going to be mistakes, but for us to develop leadership and a vision and an agenda to help move people through processes and support people in their development so that we can create a movement for collective liberation where people are struggling in different communities and different issues in different ways, but that we're able to move people in large numbers. And for myself, the book really explores a wide range of organizing experiences for myself over the past 25 years, as well as interviews with a number of specifically anti-racist groups working in white communities around the country. But the core theme is really how can we move from white people around racism, the message being don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. The don'ts are important, but the do this, and here's this, and then here's this, and then here's that, and here's how you actually have an important way of bringing leadership. Not just like, help out, but you need to be involved because your life depends on it. For men, the same thing around feminism. And again, there's the small steps and there's the big steps, and we need to have a vision and a plan that incorporates many steps. So I'll just close on just the general vision, and the general purpose of the book is really trying to provide lessons and insights around organizing specifically with this collective liberation vision in a way that is, as much as possible, how do we create organization, cultures, the ways that we relate to each other, the ways that we hang out together, the ways that we build together, the ways that we love, live, play together. How can we create culture that supports and sustains this positive, proactive, let's build, as opposed to what can often happen in activist communities, is that we try to work for our vision, we feel a tremendous sense of powerlessness against the enormity of what we're against, and then begin to exercise our power by tearing one another apart. And we need to support one another to have a creative, positive way of relating and building together. And vision and strategy and leadership, I believe, are key to those things. Thank you.
All right, folks. So now we have a very special portion of the evening where we just get to ask questions. So, does anyone out there, just take hands and I'll kind of take stack if people want to start asking questions. And people on the panel can feel free to ask questions of each other. What do you hear? What do you like about what you heard? What comes up for you? What do you want to know more about? Things like that. I saw Adrian out there. Anyone else want to get on a stack? Okay. 1, 2, 3. Gotcha. Okay, let's start off with that.
So, Chris, I loved your vision. I love what you're saying, that we need ways to get through all of these barriers, emotional barriers, and have large and small steps. But I have no idea what you're talking about. Because it obviously hasn't been built yet. But it would help if you could give at least one example of what you're saying.
Well, some of the examples, specifically around, so for example, like anti-racist organizing in white communities. There is a group in Oregon called the Rural Organizing Project, who are really doing fantastic work. And so they were formed after there was an anti-queer ballot measure that was being put forward in the state of Oregon, and a lot of the folks there and in other parts of the country were beginning to have the conversation that the right wing really makes rural communities a priority and sees rural communities all over the country as their base, and that often the left is primarily based in large urban, often West Coast, East Coast cities, and a lot of the resources aren't going to other parts of the country, let alone rural communities. Well, so the Rural Organizing Project was started in Oregon specifically with the idea of how can we try to provide more resources, political education, leadership support, helping to build up grassroots organizations in those communities. Well, Oregon's also a very white state with a lot of white working class folks. There's been more and more Latino immigration into Oregon that's then created a different dynamic of being able to also form some more multiracial alliances or cross-race alliances. So with the Rural Organizing Project, one of the things that they've done with these small steps and the big steps is, it's one of those, it's a challenge I think a lot of us face. You sort of start to do this work, and the people who are already on board jump on board. The people who are like, yes, let's work for peace and justice, let's work against racism, let's work, for queer liberation, we're down. But how do you then simultaneously create space to bring people along who are deeply resistant to not just part of that agenda, but most of that agenda? And so the big steps have been, let's form, so they formed, over 60 local groups in throughout, the rural communities in Oregon. So local groups that then do a variety of activities in their community. But then on big steps, the Rural Organizing Project formed an alliance with the farm worker organizing that was going on in the state, with immigrant rights organizing going on in the state, mostly with Latina workers and communities, and started forming these alliances. And then they did an incredible, march for democracy through the state around immigrant rights, in the war, peace and justice in our communities. Well, those are some big steps. Well, small steps was they started realizing that, again, they were attracting all the white people who were already committed to this broader anti-racist politics and this larger vision. And so one of the things they started thinking about was, we want to have a base that's rooted in working class. You know, and a lot of the folks involved were working class. That's my little guy. That's River. He's a little love of my life right here, this little guy. So yeah, parenting, small steps, big steps for sure. So one of the things they started realizing was like, okay, cool, we've got all these people on board all over the state in all these different communities. But we want to actually build our base. We don't want to just have the 10 people in all these different communities who are already down. But how do we build our base without alienating everyone else? Because, you know, if you want to really build a base that includes and makes room for people who are in lots of different places, they're going to say and act in all kinds of ways that are going to deeply offend a whole lot of other people. Someone comes, they've got all these kinds of, like, you know, they don't have some advanced feminist politics. They're saying all kinds of, you know, various things, or then the various people involved who are women leaders are not being recognized, not being respected for their leadership. So how do you then simultaneously make room for your base to organize them while simultaneously having a commitment to these politics and not alienating your core people? So what they talked about was, how do you make room for your base? And they started doing living room conversations around immigrant rights in particular, where they would have local leaders identify people in their community to then bring folks together for living room conversations. And so that way a different, you know, say you got 10 people in a group, 5 of those people host living room conversations and bring together their networks, their families, to be able to have some conversations around immigrant rights and what are people say, and consciously knowing that a lot of stuff is going to come up that is really problematic and difficult. And that's actually the point. We don't want to create a space where it's like, we want everyone to come to learn about racism. Okay, let's bring a whole lot of white people, but then the only white people who are allowed to stay in the room already get it. Because if anybody says anything slightly off, 5 people are going to be like, you're messed up. That should happen periodically in some spaces when that's necessary, but you also need to create spaces and opportunities for people to really work through stuff and get supported in a process over time to get involved. Because people learn a tremendous amount when they're in motion. When people are stuck, when people are just watching the news or reading the paper and forming their opinions, they're generally going to be stuck in their opinions. But when you can start getting people involved and in motion, transformative things can happen. So getting some of those people from living room conversations to then go on the march to support the peace and justice part, even if they didn't feel totally comfortable with the immigrant rights part. But to support those people in that process and be in conversation with your allies, you know, in this case, the immigrant rights and, you know, Latino farm worker organizing, of like, hey, we're going to be trying to do this work, and it's going to get dicey in moments, but we're going to be accountable and take responsibility for when stuff comes up. It's not going to be like someone just says something to one of your members and totally offends them, and we're just like, hey, we're all in this together, sorry, some things happen. But more of like, yeah, things are going to happen, and we're going to try to take responsibility for it, but we are also trying to build a space where people can take small steps to get to the point where we can take big steps together. If that is helpful.
Mr. Rowan Sens. You did.
Wasn't someone before me?
I think you both raised your hand at the same time. Find it out.
Okay.
Negotiate, compromise.
I think you answered my question with the living room conversational thing, so maybe it's not a question becomes a comment instead. I'll say it anyway. All 4 of you, and the first question touched on this thing of connecting otherwise isolated groups, people who are either by nature or by manipulation, by choice of manipulation, felt to feel isolated and not to come with each other. And obviously I'm not from this country. I've been for a long time, but I spent a lot of time back in places I used to, where I grew up. And one thing that's really noticed about modern America is the isolation between individuals. And this thing, I noticed a shift like 5-6 years ago when the economy started to really get shaky. A lot of people are called middle class in this country, the people working class in other countries, people with jobs and houses, in other words, started to talk to each other, and because of the fear, started to relate to each other more. I thought, great, we should have a little more of a crash, so it becomes like America was 200 years ago. People talk to each other and engage. And it stopped. After a couple of years, it went back, people started to get jobs jobs again. It's those who lost their homes, and those who kept their homes felt all smug again, and then it's back to normal. No one's talking to each other. So the question was really, how do you address that? Because the isolation seems to be symptomatic of the modern culture as much as of specific things between different races, different gender groups, and so forth. And other than the living room conversations, which reminded me of the host things like that myself here. Other than that, how do we break down this thing? Being a missionary or a union activist isn't really, I'm knocking on the doors that close, but this isn't too popular among people who by nature, by habit rather, are watching their own videos on their own screen at home. They close the door, the world's outside, they don't want to know.
Okay, I want to say something. Yeah, I do. So that's something I find myself thank you. I find myself thinking about that a lot because as a student organizer in particular, it's very hard. Students are very busy people. It's hard to get students out of their like when we're tabling at the JC, it's very difficult to get people to stop and honestly be interested in the California State Student Union, even though we're fighting for things that they're obviously experiencing as a negative, whatever. It's hard to get them, and it's hard to even get people to talk about those kinds of issues. And I think part of that is because we live in this culture, right, where you're told things like you have to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and whatever, and it's very, when you're in a situation, it's almost embarrassing and you want to deal with it yourself. And so, but when it becomes everyone around you is experiencing that and you can tell, and the news is not only when you were talking about, right, during that time, the news was telling us all that we're in a crisis too. So when you're hearing that, you're more likely to reach out. And I think a big way that we can combat that is just by having people who are willing to break those walls down, having us tabling and being like, hey, talk to us about this. And when they don't want to talk to you, you keep talking to them. And if somebody clearly is not wanting to talk to you, they will let you know and you can leave them alone. But when it's someone who is, they just seem like they don't want to discuss the issues because they're in a box, or whatever, it's important to, it's very important to break those. And that's, in my mind, that's how we get this whole thing started, is by breaking down those barriers of I'm busy in my own little life, I'm going to be over here and not pay attention to the issues out there. It's about making people realize that there's not really a box there, okay? And you just need to look pretty much past your own experience and you will see so much wrong. And I think having discussions like that and calling people out in public really is a good way to, just agitating.
Okay. I think also inherent in your comment is a really important lesson. You said something about culture and kind of change in cultural norms. And I think we have to always remind ourselves that culture changes and we have power to organize to change culture and to change the norm and to change the way that our society holds us and that we hold it and that we shape it. And one of the really important lessons from domestic worker organizing nationally is this concept of interdependence. And it can be, we're all interconnected, you mentioned that word, and the intersectionality piece fits in too, but something really central to domestic worker organizing is that domestic workers want to care for their employers. Dora did not want to report that man who abused her and exploited her because he was elderly and sick, and she didn't want to bring him more trouble into his life. So she cared for him, even though he totally took advantage of her and manipulated her. And to this day, she has, feelings of wishing he was okay and, hoping the best for him. So this concept also, just to say, the baby boomer, retirement rate is happening at such a rate where I think someone becomes 65 every 8 minutes in the United States. And so this need for caregivers and people who are going to be receiving care is just it's going to balloon. And so the domestic worker movement is actually a movement to change the culture of care. It's to change the way that we not only care for the elderly, but that then the domestic workers that are doing that work are cared for too. And so integral to any, discourse around domestic workers' rights, and when we're talking to we're doing lobby visits and we're talking to politicians, we're saying we want to make sure that workers and recipients in the care industry are considered equal and valid humans. And so it's actually that the concept of moving toward collective liberation, it's moving towards a cultural shift that at least in the movement I'm part of, that is at its root is propelled by women of color, immigrants who are caring for our homes and our children and our parents.
Okay, so we're taking turns. Okay. All right, sounds good. The first thing that comes to mind is something I heard a while back. I can't recall who mentioned it, but it was that we're all natural storytellers. This is what we do. Carlos Santana was fond of saying that it didn't matter if I was performing in a room of 5 people or 5,000 people. I still got to go out there and perform. And so that's one of the things I would tell my sister when she was just panicking for her speech class. She's like, "Oh my God, I don't know." She doesn't like that I do that, but it comes out every time for some reason. And she would get really nervous, and I would tell her, "Look, that same story, that same speech, you just gave it to me. You just gave me the speech that you're going to go tell in front of 20, 30 people. What's the difference? You still got to go out there and perform." And so this is something that's natural to human beings. We tell stories to friends, family, or a large audience, kind of like we're doing right now. And that was one of the things that we, as far as undocumented immigrant youth, was that how do we find common ground with other folks, because not everybody's undocumented, but there's a lot of folks that work with us as allies in this kind of organizing. So, for example, like with Tess, when we talk about undocumented youth, we also have undocuqueer. And that was a word that a lot of folks within our movement have embraced, because we've taken immigrant rights and LGBTQ, and what's the common ground? Well, the common ground is, I said the word earlier, I said I was undocumented, I said I was coming out. That's a term that we borrowed from LGBTQ, right? We borrowed, but that could only happen if we had a conversation, we told our stories, they told their stories, and all of a sudden now we found some common ground. It's like, I remember it was a few years ago, Positive Images, one of the local LGBTQ teen groups here, they'd come to one of our groups, and they'd shared their stories. And they're like, "Man, I get really tired because I have to come out like a bunch of times a day, and I like got to come out to everybody all the time. I'm like always coming out." And that got me thinking of what coming out means, how sharing your story, how that impacts other people, how that impacted my buddy Jeff, who went from supporting Herman Cain's 999 tax plan to being like, "Dude, we're gonna get out there and march for you." All of a sudden he understood where I was coming from and what I was going through, and where the common ground now was, I shared my story, I know your story, can we find some common ground to actually get some work done here? And so it's really about sharing our story. That's where so much of our, at least, strength for undocumented immigrant youth has been sharing our narratives, because everybody's got a story, right? Every single one of you here has a story, and it's of value. It means something, and every story that you have has been told a number of one time. Every one of you has an individual, unique story that needs to be heard. And so that's where our strength comes from, and as far as organizing, that's the basis of it, and where so much strength can be found as far as once you share a story, where are the commonalities and how can we work from there. So to answer your question, it really starts with having those living room conversations. Cesar Chavez was fond of doing those house meetings, organizing the farm workers that way. People were able to share their stories, and then the train just starts moving from there.
And I just want to add really quickly that as someone who has experienced discrimination because I'm queer and genderqueer and whatever, all that stuff, I guess some of the most enlightening conversations that you can ever have are conversations just like that, where you find common ground like that. Like having some of the conversations that stick out most in my mind are conversations with undocumented people, where we talk about how it feels to come out, right? Or how it feels like once someone knows that about you, how they treat you differently maybe, or how their politics can influence how they treat you and you're like, "Oh, I thought you were a cool person because you always treated me nice until you knew I was queer." Great, and so I feel like having those conversations in activist circles is so super important, because you can start to see things that you do that are super wrong and that you would not ever want to be doing, but you didn't even recognize that it was wrong until you had that conversation and had someone point out to you, well, you know, when you say that, it's kind of like when someone says this about you and this thing of, you know, like how you're queer. When you say this, it's kind of like when someone says this about you, you know, being queer. And I'm like, oh, wow, you know, it really is like that. And then you have this like moment of humility, right? And we all get defensive and we all are like, well, hang on, maybe it's not. But then you have to really, you really have to like, developing that humility is so important, and that is like the thing that will make it like possible for us to relate on those wavelengths, is to be like, okay, I was being a racist bitch, I'm sorry, like I'm gonna stop and I'm not gonna act like that anymore, you know, and being able to admit that is like so important, and having those conversations is where that comes from.
Let's have one more question. You still want to?
Yeah.
Cool.
So this is less, I think, a question that